All right, hello everyone. I'm here for a midterm audio-only review of the material, the course material for the first half of this course for PHIL 1009 and Ethics and Society. And what I want to do is basically give you an audio-only portion of this presentation so we can actually see the things that I'm talking about here. So I'm going to just move some of this material over so we can get to the slideshow. And from the beginning, here we go. So this is the midterm test. So I'm going to move this part out of the way. All right, so the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, what is morality? And this was module 1A, 1B. 1A is just basically the course introduction. Don't need to worry about that. But here are some terms, some ideas to consider. Moral philosophy, what is that? That's a study of principles concerning the difference between right and wrong. And this is the key here, between good and bad behavior. That's why the course is called Ethics and Society, because our behavior is always within a social context. So our ideas about morality have to do with the way in which we express that morality through our ethical behavior. So moral philosophy is a study of the systems and values and principles of conduct, our duties, our expectations of each other, and basically the way we interact with one another in society. So if moral philosophy is about the values and principles that inform our conduct, then moral judgments must be backed up with good reasons. Why are we behaving this way? Because it's the right thing to do. My behavior will result in the greater good. Or I'm going to always make sure that I never lie to someone, use them as a means to an end, whatever that value happens to be. The moral judgments must always be backed up with good reasons. So morality itself, not just moral philosophy, but morality requires the impartial consideration of each individual's interest. Now, that statement in and of itself is interesting and valuable, but once we get to utilitarianism, we see that that statement isn't always true, because if I impartially consider everyone, eventually I can't make a decision. So utilitarianism says, well, let's go for the greatest amount of good, not 100%, but as close as we can. So there will be certain individuals whose interests are not met or not satisfied. So morality, in theory, is the impartial consideration of these individuals. And when we are trying to discover what the best form of behavior, the good behaviors we call it, we try to always use reason in order to guide our thinking, our judgments. And finally, moral theories presuppose impartiality, like I just mentioned, not all the time, but we would like to try to think that we are being impartial. And each individual's interests are equally important. No one should get special treatment. And that really is true with deontology, not so true with utilitarianism. And we should not treat members of a particular group as inferior. Again, in theory, yes, but depending on which side of the moral fence you sit, if you are a utilitarian, there are certain groups that you may consider to be less important. So keep that in mind when you think about moral philosophy, moral judgments, moral theory, and morality itself. Okay, so now I want to make sure I can move to the next one. So in our the beginning of the first week, we looked at several very important cases, and really we kind of jumped into the deep end of this because we wanted to look at the very difficult situations of baby Teresa, Jody Marie, Tracy Latimer, and look to see how each one of them plays out in terms of these two positions I've described, the utilitarian one, the greater good, and deontology being basically the categorical imperative of always doing the same thing every time. Never to lie, never to cheat, never to use a person as a means to an end. So in this case, baby Teresa, what are we to do? Now, if we believe as utilitarians that we should have been allowed to euthanize baby Teresa if she was going to die anyway, if we can benefit a person, or in this case, a group of people, without harming really anyone else, baby Teresa was practically dead when she was born, then we ought to do so. We ought to transplant the organs in order to benefit other children without, in theory, again, harming baby Teresa. She was born without a brain, so she was not technically a human being, a sentient being. Now, that's an argument in favor of doing that. The argument against that is the deontological one that says, no, it's wrong to kill one person to save another. It's also wrong to use a person as a means to an end. In this case, we would have euthanized baby Teresa and harvested her organs. So if you are a deontologist or an ethicist, you'd say, no, I'm sorry, but you're violating the autonomy of this person. Baby Teresa, regardless of her physical ailment, her age, her likelihood to die, doesn't matter. She's still a human being. And deciding to euthanize her and harvest her organs violates her autonomy. So in this case, as you can see, and with many others, it's not a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of two rights that clash together. And what you have to decide is in your heart, which is the one that you think is the more valid or the more reasonable of the two. The second case with Jody Marie, here we have kind of a reversal with baby Teresa. It was Florida law that prohibited the euthanizing and harvesting of the organs. With Jody Marie, we have the hospital that is more than willing to conduct the operation to separate the two because only one will survive. And Jody Marie's parents, being Catholic, wanted the two of them born no matter what, let them survive for as long as they possibly can. And the hospital, the wisdom and experience that they had said, no, we can save one. Unfortunately, the other one will 100% die, but we will be able to save Jody because Jody and Marie both share a heart, but it happens to be within Jody's sort of within her chest rather than Marie's. So the rationale for separating the twins in order to save one, that's again, the utilitarian perspective. At least there will be an increase in happiness when one of the children is allowed to survive. Again, from a deontological perspective, that would be the one that the parents had. And that's different from the first with baby Teresa. The parents were utilitarians. And the second one, it's the hospital that is utilitarian in its thinking. Now, the parents of Jody Marie very much loved their children. They were devout Catholics and did not believe that killing one to save the other was right. They believed in the sanctity of life. And so the question becomes, what if the innocent life that we're looking at has no future, right? No desire, no ability to continue living. Are we actually killing that person? So there are always questions that we need to grapple with as we sort of navigate through this awful dilemma and are guided by reason and objectivity and impartiality. And we try to come up with the best plan of attack, right? Or the best plan of action in this case. The third case in the first week is Tracy Latimer, 12-year-old Tracy Latimer, who victim of cerebral palsy. Her father, Robert, euthanized her, and he was charged with second-degree murder. He served time in jail. And again, the arguments in favor, the utilitarian one, was that Tracy weighed less than 40 pounds. She had basically the mental level of a three-month-old baby, and the prospects of life were essentially biological. So the quality of life would have been negligible. So that's the utilitarian argument in favor of euthanasia. The argument against it was that Tracy's life was morally precious, regardless of her ailment or disability, and that Mr. Latimer had no right to kill her. So Tracy, in this case here, was killed because she was handicapped. Now, was she discriminated against? Technically, yes, because of her disability, but that's not to say that that was the only reason why she was killed. She was also suffering. So Robert Latimer denied that she was killed because of her disability. He said instead, she was killed because she was suffering without hope. So that was his moral compass, his reason for doing what he did. So again, Robert Latimer, the hospital that performed the operation to separate Jody Marie, and baby Teresa's parents, all three of those individuals were utilitarians. So that's where we see for the first time these two sides or these two opposing forces clashing and trying to figure out what the best thing to do. Now, we also talked about something called a slippery slope. And this is when we try to make an argument of kind of the what if then something else. And often the something else is much worse. Now, is that a good way to argue? No, because it becomes hypothetical. Just because something is does not mean or will follow suit that something far worse is going to occur. Once you start talking about the far worse, these are future states. These are conditional states. And ultimately, they're hypothetical states. So a slippery slope argument is a good way to end an argument. But if you're trying to discuss something with someone using the slippery slope, basically it's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. If you argue this way, you end up arguing about hypothetical situations, and really it doesn't help anyone, because we're not dealing with facts. We're just dealing with possibilities and potentialities. So instead of using a slippery slope, we should let reason guide us through this dilemma to see if we can figure out the best way to move forward. And we give equal weight to the interests of all the individuals that are affected by our decision. Okay, so that's module 1. Excuse me, module 2. And we wanted to talk about, well, the simple question of why should we be moral, right? What difference does it make? Why do we care about what we're doing, whether it's right or not? Well, we used to have an entity that in the lives of many people still do, the fact that we have commandments, right, that come from the holy book, and literally all holy books, Quran, the Bible, the Torah, any of those holy books essentially say the same thing, right? The sanctity of life, the commandments that are presented to us by these higher beings tell us what to do, right? They tell us what is right and wrong. So if a spiritual entity, a God, Allah, whoever, is telling us that something is wrong, that's what makes it wrong. End of discussion. But how can we know what this spiritual entity commands and know that it's right? So if God has good reasons for his instructions, and there must be a standard of rightness that is independent of his commands. I don't like saying his, I'd just like to say it's, because God should not even be a human being. It's just an entity. So we'll say it's at this point. If this entity has good reasons for their instructions, it's because what they say is correct. But what do you do if someone is atheist or agnostic, right? Who are they going to believe? And this was essentially the issue by the 17th century, the 1600s, where ethics became secular. In other words, not reliant or leaning up against the Bible or some religious institution, because society was transforming and moving away from a feudal society with lords and dukes and duchesses and an all-powerful church. As society became more secular, it now needed a new guideline, a new set of principles by which to create a good society. But it had to be one that was secular, because by this point, there are many different kinds of religions, Protestantism, Anglican, Muslim, and the Jewish faith was around as well. So there were many different religions and slight variations between them. So if we can create a set of ethics that is secular, we're likely to have fewer religious wars. Because if you are any kind of a history buff, if you look at the 1,000-year reign between 1,000 and, let's say, the 1600s in Europe, it was nothing but religious wars. So having enough of those dictated pretty clearly that there had to be an ethical foundation to society that was secular, right? And nothing to do with religion. And that's essentially what Thomas Hobbes begins to do. He tries to create a secular basis for ethics by saying, look, we're all essentially alike. We're self-interested creatures. We want to live as well as possible. And we want to try to come together in a cooperative society, but only if we can adopt certain rules of behavior, such as telling the truth, keeping promises, respecting one another, not killing one another, and not living as if we were in a state of nature, which is something we'll talk about when we look at the social contract theories in more detail in the next term. So if that is the case, we must try to strike a bargain with one another. We must set up rules and sort of duties that are expected of us. And morality, from that perspective, that is just what we need to get along with one another, very simple. If that's the case, then morality can be understood as a rule that any self-interested person would want to agree to, because everyone would like to be able to live peacefully in a society with others, knowing that everyone obeys the rules, everyone knows what the rules are, but they're not sacred, they're secular, right? They apply to everyone. So if that's the case, then following duties and expectations will take the mystery out of ethics. It makes it very practical, very down to earth. And then we know what our social roles are. Pretty straightforward. And ultimately, having duties and expectations of each other in society kind of takes a mystery out of what we need to do, and it gives us a very plausible answer to the question, why should we behave morally when it's not to our advantage? Well, sure, there's going to be a small percentage of people that are going to say, I don't need to follow this. But generally speaking, the majority of people do, because think about it. If we're self-interested, wouldn't we want to behave because we want society to continue to function so we can benefit from it? And that's what Hobbes knew. He was kind of a proto-psychologist. He knew how people thought. And he said, yeah, you're selfish, but think about it. Isn't it selfish for you to behave well because society continues to exist? So one of the ways in which Hobbes goes about presenting this is by using this utilitarian perspective. Now, what is that? Utilitarianism is this idea that we should always try to produce the greatest possible benefits for anyone who would be affected by our ethical actions. So it's guided by three main ideas, right? We're guided by our actions, what we do, not necessarily what we say, but what we do will result with hopefully a greater amount of happiness. And the second one is we care only about the benefits or harms that that action would cause. And three, that each person's happiness is as important as anyone else's. Again, that third part is kind of hypothetical because a utilitarian perspective is not one that benefits every single person, the majority of people. So each person's happiness is temporarily thought of, right, is important, but ultimately decisions are made. And those decisions should be made on the basis of, can I increase the amount of happiness in society, or at least decrease the amount of misery? Now, having said that, there are criticisms against utilitarians. First of all, that they tend to ignore conventional religious notions, such as the sanctity of life. They also have no use for any kind of absolute moral rules, the kinds of rules that are part and parcel of the categorical imperative or deontology, which is essentially the same thing. So we have ignoring religious notions, the sanctity of life. That's not sort of a deciding factor. Two, no absolute rules. In other words, we can do different things at different times, right? We don't do the same thing all the time. And three, that ultimately our moral duties to promote general happiness, but it's the happiness of society, which I know is a bit of a contradiction, but society as a whole is happier. And that's why when we look at it, the behavior of utilitarians is one where they may be quite selfless in saying, well, this will increase overall happiness or decrease misery in society, even if I have to personally hurt for a short period of time. So remember, it's always about society's overall happiness, not individuals. So that is a bit of an odd idea, but there it is. So utilitarians had a moral duty to help others. This is why they came up with this concept in the first place. And this is not based on religion. It's simply based on the notion of being helpful, of not being selfish, of looking out for one another. And if we can do that, the tendency or the hope is for society to keep functioning. So social contract theories or theorists, for example, function along the same way. They can look at a situation and say, again, is this action helping or hindering this society? If it is helping, let's have more of it. If it's hindering, we need to change that. So other thinkers, we've had Hobbes, Jeremy Bentham is another one we'll look at in a moment. John Stuart Mill is another one. And he calls that moral duty to help others a conscientious feeling, right? So we're conscientious of our actions. We're aware that what we do will affect other people. It's that simple. Peter Singer, a more recent person who is, I believe, still alive, says, look, we have the capacity to be rational, but we also have the capacity of feelings. And if we think of both of them, we really shouldn't make a distinction between someone that is very close by versus someone that might live on the other side of the world, and we help them through charity. Both individuals are equally important. Now we move on to cultural relativism, which in itself is not part of the utilitarian deontological dilemma, but it is a different kind of dilemma. Okay, so what is that? Well, it starts with an idea originally presented by Ruth Benedict, who says that different cultures have different moral codes. And really, at the end of the day, It's not the moral codes necessarily, it's the ethical expression of those codes. That's what makes cultures different from one another. And what that means is conceptions of right and wrong behavior differ from culture to culture. And we would be very naive if we were to think that they are unconditioned or absolute universal moral truths that apply right across the board globally. That's not the case. So there is no such standard that is universally applicable around the world. Every idea is culture bound. So every idea about what is good and bad behavior has to be fixed and compared to the culture from which it is, what is from, and where it is expressed. So there's no such thing as universal truth in ethics when we talk about cultural relativism. And cultural relativism challenges that belief in the objectivity and universality of morality. It's there, it just looks very different. So the question becomes, how much do they differ? Because the issue typically with students as they sort of argue and work their way through cultural relativism is they say, look, at one point, we've got to be able to call something out when it's horrible. Absolutely. There is no part of cultural relativism that says that you have to turn the other cheek or look the other way while a particular country is practicing genocide. No, it's horrible no matter where it's expressed. So the question becomes, in terms of society and its behavior, do certain behaviors help or hinder that society? If they help, then obviously it is useful for that society, whether it's to eat bugs or some strange thing that we don't typically do. And again, I just very not so subtly kind of denigrated what you said by saying, some strange thing. It's a form of behavior. And sometimes it's really hard to take that out of our conversation or in our way of thinking. But what we need to think about here is those differences may not actually be differences at all, because here's where there is a comparison. The difference is not in the behavior, the difference is in the behavior, but not in the value system. I started this video by saying there is morality and there's ethics. Morality is the value system that we carry around in our heads. Ethics is the expression of that value system. So what I'm saying here is, even with cultural relativism, the value system, generally speaking, is very similar. The sanctity of life, for example, to refrain from lying, to refrain from using people as a means to an end. These are universal values that is required for any society to function. Without them, it falls apart pretty quickly. So the difference is in the expression of a very similar value system. So if the behavior is counterproductive, or it hinders that society, or hinders a significant portion of that population, then clearly it's wrong. So once we see that and we look at it and say, no, this is bad. This is benefiting a small number of people, and it is inherently wrong. It is hindering that society. Okay, so some of the consequences here, there's a bunch of them. One, we can no longer argue that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to ours. They're merely different. We can no longer criticize the codes of our own society because ours are only one among many. Three, the idea of moral progress is called into question, because if that is the case, then we simply can say that different countries develop at different speeds. We've talked many years about developed nations, and we now call the other remaining countries developing nations. So they're all moving at a certain pace, but the idea of moral progress is not a universal absolute idea. It looks different depending on where you see it, but as long as a society is moving forward, a culture is moving forward, then there is still a degree of moral progress. It just moves at a different pace, that's all. So certain values are more or less universal, as I mentioned, truth-telling, sanctity of life, and those are the things we need to look at, because they're the rules that are necessary for a society to exist in the first place. So if you ask yourself, does that behavior promote or help in some way or hinder the welfare of the people affected by it? And that's really the only question we need to ask, right? We should be more tolerant of other cultures, absolutely. But if a culture is engaging in genocide, no, we need to call it out because it is inherently wrong no matter where it is expressed. So different societies have different moral codes. That's true. These codes determine what is right or wrong within that society. 3, no objective standard can be used to judge those moral codes. We need to look at them individually. 4, the moral code of our own society has no special status. Ours is no better or worse than another. It's simply different. And then finally, the 5th one, it's arrogant or wrong to judge other cultures because those moral codes are culture bound. Now, really what it is, it's the ethical behavior is culture bound, but the value system that informs that behavior, that's fairly universal. So we should not tolerate just everything, right? Slavery, racism, systemic violence, genocide. These are things that are inherently wrong, no matter which society is practicing it. So just because cultural relativism is asking us to basically judge a culture by its own standards, sometimes those standards are left wanting, right? And the behavior is actively harming a group of individuals in that society. If that's the case, it is wrong, no matter what. All right, so the week after, we talked about ethical and psychological egoism, and the idea here is both are somewhat flawed. So let's cut to the chase here. So the ideas here are ethical egoism, which is where we ought to pursue our own self-interest exclusively. Big difference here with psychological egoism, which says that we are in fact hardwired to pursue our own self-interest exclusively. So what is the difference? Ethical egoism, the key word here is ethical. When we talk about ethics, we talk about oughts versus is, and we ought to behave in a certain way. So ethical egoism claims essentially that we ought to pursue, right? We ought to make a choice to pursue our own self-interests exclusively. Psychological egoism, and keyword here, psychological, right? The hardwired part of our brain says that no, we do it regardless. Even if we try not to, ultimately we do. So we look at this and say, well, can we apply this to any kind of behavior? Well, we need to be very, very careful. Because if you were to make an argument in favor of ethical egoism, you say, well, altruism or selflessness is self-defeating, because if we're going to be self-interested, then the notion of behaving altruistically is basically a moot point, right? It doesn't exist. So if you believe in ethical egoism, then selflessness is self-defeating. Altruism is also socially destructive, and that ethical egoism is compatible with common sense morality, this idea of self-interestedness. So this is something that is a really significant part of Thomas Hobbes' social contract theory. We are self-interested people, right? We ought to get together. We ought to relinquish some of the powers that we have in the state of nature, give them over to a third party, and live somewhat peacefully. So these are the arguments in favor of ethical egoism, that altruism is both self-defeating and socially destructive, and that it's instead compatible with common sense, right? It seems to make sense to us. Now, here are 3 arguments against it. Well, okay, if I'm only going to be interested in satisfying myself, you could make the case very, very easily that it endorses wickedness. What if I like to set fire to buildings? What if I like to go and murder someone? I'm satisfying my self-interestedness. I'm following the rules, right? That's what I'm doing. So it endorses horrible behavior. Not so good. It's also very logically inconsistent. And what I mean by that is you may be helping someone, let's say giving someone money on the street or buying them something to eat. And really what you're doing is, yes, you may be helping them, but deep down, you want to be able to get a good night's sleep and go to bed with a clear conscience, knowing that you've helped someone. Because even though you have helped someone and it appears to be selfless and altruistic, you're also doing it, and perhaps more so, to satisfy yourself, because you don't want to feel guilty. You don't want to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning worried about this person that you could have helped, but you didn't. And ultimately, the intention, right? The intentionality behind a behavior is really difficult to pin down. Sometimes the very person doing it isn't aware that the intentions they had were not to help someone necessarily, but also to not feel guilty. So if that's the case, then ethical egoism it just muddies the water. And finally, it's unnecessarily or unacceptably arbitrary. So it's inconsistent, it's arbitrary, just for the very reasons that I've described, because it's not a very good way to argue at all. Because instead, if we are conscientious and we'd like to live in a society where we are going to be treated as equals, we must believe in equality, that every single person should be treated fairly and equally, unless for some reason the facts demand otherwise. We shouldn't help criminals, and we shouldn't hold the door open for bank robbers as they race out the front door, although you might feel like doing it sometimes. But we need to treat people fairly and equally. And if that's the case, then the notion that we ought to be self-interested only, that kind of flies in the face of that sort of common sense. And so if that's the case, and we consider other people in our society and their needs are as important as ours, because imagine being on the other side of this, of that formula, and you're the one in need, you would want someone to help you. And you would be out there on the street, homeless and hungry, and people walking by going, well, I'm a firm believer in ethical egoism, so sorry, I can't help you. That's why it fails, right? Because it's not a consistent pattern. We don't know about the intentions, the true intentions of the person committing an otherwise selfless act. That's ultimately the problem. We looked at applied ethics after this, applied ethics being ethics about the everyday life, everyday world we live in. And Peter Singer argued that it was wrong for affluent people, in other words, rich people, to spend money at luxuries while the less fortunate are starving. Now, he talks about surplus wealth here, and that's the important thing. It isn't give all your money and live like a pauper, because that's not very cost effective or even efficient, because you end up being the very person you're trying to help. So Singer is saying affluent people who have that kind of spare cash to spend on luxuries and an extra yacht and whatever else, that's immoral. You should spend some, he says, all of your surplus wealth on helping others. And so that's the argument that Singer makes in terms of applied ethics. There's something fundamentally unethical about obscenely rich people not helping anyone. In fact, fighting tooth and nail to pay an extra penny in taxes. They want more breaks because they think that they worked hard for this money. They could have had it. They could have inherited it for all we know. The point is that there's a failure of the rich who have that kind of surplus wealth to help others who are in need. So within this class, we talk about a couple of different scenarios. Peter Singer's scenario, but helping others using surplus wealth. We talk about Peter Unger and Bob and his Bugatti. And this is a very brief story about Bob and his very expensive car that he stupidly parks on a railway track, because that's what people do when they have expensive cars. And of course, there's a train bearing down on his car, and he sees a little boy and on another track, and he's got his foot stuck in the track, and he's trying to get out. And the train is actually aiming for the young boy, not for the car. So what does he do? Does he turn the train over to the track and hit the little boy and save the car, or does he let the train hit the car and destroy it? And the moral behind this applied ethics story, as whacked out as it is if you think that it's wrong for Bob not to throw the switch and save a young boy's life, then that is really the same as saying that the money he spent on that ridiculously expensive Bugatti, he could have donated to charity. In other words, it's money he didn't need to spend on a car. He could have spent it on something else. Either way, he's going to lose it. So if he doesn't throw the switch and saves the young boy and destroys his car, it's tantamount to saying that would be the equivalent of giving that same amount of money to charity. So why is this important? Because there is a tendency to go along with what's called the follow the crowd ethics. Well, nobody else is doing it, so why should I? Well, if we all think this way, then we're going to eventually harm ourselves, because everyone's waiting for the other person to help. We should just do it simply because we can, and we should, if you're a believer in Peter Singer. Now, again, students don't have a whole lot of money. You can donate your time, for example, to read to the blind or work in a library, a soup kitchen. You don't always have to give money. So although Singer talks about surplus wealth, there are ways to help other people that aren't exactly monetary, because let's face it, most of us don't have that kind of surplus wealth that Peter Singer is talking about. All right, the last couple of weeks of the course, we talked about utilitarianism. I've talked a little bit about it already at the very beginning. Jeremy Bentham, who is the founder, considered to be the founder of utilitarianism. And what is the fundamental idea? That we are seeking pleasure, not pain, that the principle of utility behind utilitarianism is we should always choose an action that provides us with the most happiness of all. But there again, happiness of society, not individuals. So we wish to make society a better place. So critics say that, look, if we're talking about pleasure, I mean, pleasure is typically associated with, base things like stuffing yourself full of food or, having an orgy or something. And critics are not critics of utilitarianism point to that. And Mills and Bentham say, no, hold on here. Pleasures is a kind of satisfaction, a feeling of well-being, and a degree of happiness that you have done the right thing. That's when they talk about pleasure. It's not sexual pleasure, bodily pleasures. It's a kind of aesthetic or mental pleasure, that what you've done is the right thing. So you've gone beyond simply bodily pleasures, and you're moving now towards a higher plane and thinking of society as a whole. My actions will help all of society. I'm going to give blood, right? I'm going to give to charity. And I do these things because, okay, short-term pain, I might be a little bit dizzy and I might have to sit in a hospital while I'm giving blood, but it's a small price to pay for the general well-being of society. So the pursuit of utility requires that laws and social arrangements place the happiness of each individual in harmony with the whole. And not always every single person will be happy, but the majority, right? What is good for most should be good for the whole. Now, people, as well as desiring happiness, may also desire virtue. And virtue, as we'll see in the second half, is a good thing to have in and of itself for human beings, because virtuous human beings basically help the world go around, right? Good people beget good behavior, and those who are around good people tend to become good themselves. So virtue is something that should be desired, as well as happiness, because happiness by itself is kind of base, but certainly a kind of intellectual or aesthetic or social happiness is good. Virtue is good. And if you desire it for its own sake, that's fine. But you want to ultimately look to be happy through your expressions, but in such a way that it benefits others as well. So virtue sometimes is not the only thing that can be desired for itself. You may just wish to just be a decent human being, and you want to be looked at by other people as a decent human being. And if that is the case, that utilitarian standard applies rather well. So it requires the cultivation of the love of virtue as being above all things important to the general happiness. It's rare that someone who is not virtuous to also be happy, because they tend to be worried, they tend to be reckless, they tend to sort of not think about what they're doing. But someone who has a kind of a degree of happiness tends, for the most part, to be a fairly virtuous person. They can sleep at night, they have a clear conscience, they're aware that what they're doing not only matters to other people, but also matters to them. So what kind of actions are we talking about? We're talking about the kind that produces the greatest overall balance of happiness over unhappiness. And the right actions are the ones that produce the most number of good. And finally, individuals who value things other than pleasure, artistic creativity, friendship, aesthetic enjoyment, well-being, all of these things are all part of that general feeling that society is a pretty okay place to be. If we're held down and suppressed and oppressed, individuals in those societies aren't generally that happy. It's rare that people walk around with a smile on their face if they're ruled by Nazis. It doesn't work that way. But if society is open and helpful and beneficial, generally speaking, people are also helpful and feel like they're participating in that society. They're helping to make it better. So utilitarians believe that we should treat each person's happiness as equally important, again, with concessions. Those that think that it's impossible argue the following: it's too demanding to us, to our friends, to our family, because remember, we're being asked to not consider our immediate circle of friends and family, but everybody in our community, in our country, in our province, wherever. And that can be kind of difficult. As well, utilitarians also care only about the future, about the consequences of their actions. So they're not so concerned with what has occurred in the past. Each situation is unique, and as a result, they've got to be considered on their own merits. So whatever the proper action is going forward will be dictated by the unique situation that is presented in front of you. But it always looks to the future. So utilitarians always also consider the consequences, the future looking consequences of their actions. So if you are going to be utilitarian, sometimes you need to lie and cheat and violate rights in order to create that overall good. In other words, if you want your country to remain free, sometimes you have to declare war. And war usually is carnage and suffering and death. And those are not good things. But for higher-minded principles, you go to war because you have this idea of nationhood and idealistic feelings of freedom and so on, and liberty, and you're willing to fight for it. But it often will result in people dying. So we need to be really careful. So utilitarians themselves, as much as they are always about the common good and the greater good, they say sometimes that even just common sense are typical notions of what constitutes good and bad behavior may be wrong, because all values have a utilitarian basis, even lying. It's good to lie now because that person is going to feel better. I might get caught later, but right now I'm lying and it's okay. Our gut reactions shouldn't always be trusted, and we should focus instead on consequences. And that is unlike deontology. So the action itself with deontology is important. And so we should not always trust our common sense. We should be objective and rational and use reason to say, is this behavior good? Is it going to continue to lead to a better society if I continue to donate money, or if I continue to break the law? Because if I'm doing it, if I'm breaking the law regularly, I'm kind of setting a precedent for others to do the same. And one day when I go to cross the street on a green light, I'm going to end up being hit by someone that said, hey, I'm self-interested. I've got to get to work. So I don't want to stop in front of this red light. So it could lead to some horrible things. Now, we also mentioned about the categorical imperative or deontology, which is quite different from utilitarianism. We're supposed to act morally from motives that everyone at any time can live by. That's what makes it absolute and universal. Now, it also is based on reason rather than notions of pleasure or feelings or even consequences. So it is purely about reason. It's a reasonable way to act, and we're asked to act only according to a maxim by which it could become a universal law. So notice that we have absolute rules, universal laws and rules, and social norms that are going to be applied to everyone, everywhere, to act the same way. So there's no wiggle room, right? There's no room here for us to start thinking about, well, I'm just going to lie a little bit here, maybe not, not the next time. And of course, the next time it is better to lie. So deontologists focus on the rightness or the wrongness of the actions themselves, as opposed to the rightness and wrongness of its consequences. So deontology focuses on actions, utilitarians focus on consequences. So deontologists look at the here and now, utilitarians on the future. So even in terms of the action or the means and ends, that's quite different if you consider the two positions. So whether a situation is good or bad depends on whether the action that brought it about was itself right or wrong. So what is right takes priority over what is good. What that means is what is the right thing to do every time. Do not lie. Do not use a person as a means to an end. Do not do all the things that utilitarians would sometimes do. That's the right thing to do each time, because you would want the same thing done to you. And so what is right takes priority over what is good, what is easy, what is expedient, what is a quick solution, what may bring a slightly higher amount of happiness. So that's why this statement here at the bottom is important. What is right takes priority over what is good, or even what is easy. So utilitarians have argued that deontologists fail to specify which principles should take priority. And really in the end, deontology is simply about knowing that you will do the same thing every time. So even though there are principles, each of them apply equally under all conditions. So the claim that it doesn't offer complete moral guidance, actually it does. And the guidance is do the same thing all the time. It's actually easier. It's literally easier to be a deontologist than a utilitarian because it's the same thing every time. That's what makes it universal. That's what makes it absolute. So Kant's categorical imperative, by a form of criticism, it's really just another way of saying that the ends justify the means. Yes, but the difference is the ends are not a greater amount of happiness because the friend that you choose not to lie to may not be happy about it, but they may respect the fact that you're telling the truth. So now you've got to measure happiness in a different way. And utilitarians may not have a formula to measure just that. Okay, then we've got onto the drug war very quickly here. The main idea is the argument is presented. The prohibitionists that say drugs are extremely harmful, they say drug use is harmful to users. Therefore, the government should prohibit people from doing things that harm themselves. Thus, the government should prohibit drug use. The problem is the legalizers say, hold on, there's something wrong with this syllogism. That's what this is, this three-part formula. Some drugs are actually beneficial because when we say that the government should prohibit people from doing things that harm themselves, there are all kinds of things that people do that are harmful to their health, long-term, short-term, and why aren't those things banned? So this is the argument that legalizers say, no, the government doesn't have the right to do that. It should be up to us. Because if we are going to ask the government to prohibit people from doing things that harm themselves, that's a long list of things that are harmful to us. So if you look at it from that perspective, drug prohibition is unjust and violates our rights. So Michael Huemer looks at the second clause, prohibit things that harm individuals, as implausible. He says, what about smoking? What about drinking? So Michael Huemer is against the government stepping in and stopping or making illegal the use of drugs on this theoretical point. He's not saying go ahead and shoot up and take meth and everything else. He's not saying that. But he says, in theory, if you look at the way in which his argument is constructed, the second clause is problematic because to prohibit things that harm individuals, there are so many other things that do the same thing, short-term and long-term, that the government would be busy banning literally everything. So if that's the case, it is now banning certain forms of behavior. So drug use statistically is less harmful than other activities such as alcohol. Drug users harm users in different ways. You can be a drug user and you could be a horrible person. You could be an obnoxious person, but then you could also be that way without taking drugs. Some people are just obnoxious just by the very, who they are. So what sorts of harm do drugs cause? Well, illicit drugs could worsen a person's health, but so does smoking, drinking, eating fatty foods, unsafe sex. Second, drugs may damage a user's relationships to or relationship to others, but so does being a complete knob, right? Being rude, ignoring others, being selfish, being self-centered, narcissistic. So drugs are not going to be what causes that. All sorts of things. Third, drugs may harm a user's financial lives, but so does gambling, so does dropping out of school, so does making bad investments. And fourth, drugs may damage a user's moral character. Well, it's hard to measure moral character on the surface or in general. You can say, yes, this is a good person, but to damage a person's moral characteristic, again, there are other ways to do it. A person could be a pathological liar, but not smoke or drink. What do you do then? So again, in theory, Michael Huemer is arguing that that second clause is problematic for all of these things I've just shown. Now, David Cusack, another philosopher, says essentially the same thing, that the state is punishing people for exercising their natural rights, right? Individuals have a right to use drugs, but the problem is once you do that, you need to be mindful of what some of the effects may be. So the right to use drugs derives from the idea that a person has a right to exercise control over their own body. So again, a theoretical argument, not promoting or condoning the use of drugs, but here in this particular lesson, we're asked to look at the way in which a syllogism, a three-part argument, is structured. And it's pretty clear that the second one, about the government stopping people from doing things that harm themselves, is much wide open, right? It's open to all kinds of abuse. So the two arguments against drug use, it not only alters a person's mind and body, but it harms their families or friends or coworkers, but so do other things. I'm not saying that drugs don't, they often do, but drug use exclusively causing these things, that's problematic because we know that other things do. So it fails to qualify as an exercise of the user's right over their body because individuals not truly acting free to decide to use drugs. As we well know, addiction is a completely different problem because some people have become addicted to fentanyl after seeing a doctor and never intended to become drug addicts. So the one issue against drug use, that's an important one because as you start taking more and more of these drugs and your addiction worsens, you're not thinking with a clear mind. Your addiction is taking over. So the notion of having autonomy and selfhood becomes very problematic. So there are some clear arguments against this kind of thinking. So on the one hand, humor says, no, the government shouldn't ban things that harm us because there's too many things. But at the same time, two arguments against drug use is the person's mind and body eventually will go, and that will harm their relationships with family and friends, as well as that degree of addiction is going to stop them from being able to think clearly. Okay, so do we want to live in a free society? Those who advocate in favor say that this is one of the representations of a free society, to have that option. In 2016, I believe, maybe 2018, in Canada, we legalized the use of cannabis. In BC, I think they've gone a little bit further. So it's slowly moving towards that, but it is not going to be wide open to every single drug. That's going to take a very, very long time if it ever does. But it took this long, and this has been an argument on the table since the 1970s to legalize cannabis and marijuana. So it's taken almost 50 years. So this is a very slow movement towards this kind of thinking. So the advocates say, yeah, there's no real good reason against that. And prohibitionists say that, yes, cannot counter the argument that individuals have a right to use drugs. Any such answer would deny that a person either has rights over their body or that consuming drugs constitutes an exercise of those rights. There should be other ways to present rights and advocacies over one's own body. Then the last two things we talked about in this course, I'm not sure how long this has been, but usually when I do a review, it takes about half hour to 45 minutes. Hopefully I'm around there. So the last two things were in looking at euthanasia for and against. So in favor of, a very powerful argument in support of euthanasia is simply one of mercy, that we can put people or euthanize people because they are suffering. So we are being merciful. So from a utilitarian point of view, and that's what this is, euthanasia is morally acceptable if it serves to increase happiness and decrease misery. So the policy should be morally right. Now, let's hold off a little bit. So the first premise is faulty because the promotion of happiness and the avoidance of misery are among many other values: freedom, justice, human rights. So we need to be careful when we were talking about euthanasia from a utilitarian point of view, that we should also consider the freedoms and justices and human rights that individuals have. Say, the other issue too that we're facing right now in Canada, and the case is now, I think, before the courts, individuals who are depressed or people who have mental illnesses. They're not terminally ill, but they would like to use the offer of medically assisted suicide. Okay, would the world actually be a better place if these people actually took their own lives? So to measure increases in happiness or decreases in misery, again, are problematic because someone who is not terminally ill but is suffering greatly from mental health issues, is that going to help that person? Are they of sound mind and body to make that kind of a decision? So properly administered euthanasia or doctor-assisted suicide, which is what we have, would not violate human rights if we think that the action promotes the best interest of everyone concerned, especially the patient, and violates no one's rights. If that's the case, then the action is morally acceptable. 2, euthanasia promotes the best interests of everyone concerned and violates no one's rights because the patient is the one who is requesting it and asking to follow through with this action. And 3, euthanasia is morally acceptable. It's in the best interest of the patient, family, friends, the hospital staff, and other patients. Now, the argument against euthanasia is one made the most powerful one by J.G. Williams, is one that says, okay, it's inherently wrong because we're not looking at it from the right perspective. He says, look, every human being has a natural inclination to continue living, right? Our will to survive is very strong. Euthanasia literally violates that natural goal of survival. It literally goes against our human nature because all of our processes of nature are moving towards, or always leaning towards, bodily survival. And so if that's the case, then euthanasia defeats this mechanism that we have in our minds to survive at all cost. So it is counterintuitive, counterproductive to the way we look at ourselves as human beings. So the other issue too, the aspect of euthanasia, is that it's taking a human life. Euthanasia, Dr. Sitz's suicide, these are soft words that J.G. Williams says, okay, they're still couching the fact that a person's going to die. So whether it's a doctor who's going to murder that person, but murder still implies this idea that it's an act that is unknown to the victim. There's not a victim in this case, but what he's really saying here is it's still taking a human life. However you want to describe it, it's still taking human life, which we need to always be mindful of. So it is a deliberate and intentional action to end a person's life. So we should never lose sight of that. And also too, the deliberate intentional aspect of killing is something that is equally important as we consider passive and active euthanasia. What we have been describing is what's called active euthanasia. The patient is alive and awake and reasonable sound body and mind and saying, I wish for this to happen. They have a degree of control over when they choose to die. Passive euthanasia is something that is far more terrifying that J.G. Williams talks about. And he says, look, passive euthanasia is something in which the patient has no control. Let's say they're in a coma, or let's say the doctors decide on behalf of the patient that, well, we think they're too far gone, they're not worth saving, so we're just going to withhold medication and let them die. So think about that for a moment. The medication is there to probably relieve pain as much as to make you comfortable. So by withholding medication, that will be a painful death, a death that is now held at bay by the medication. So passive euthanasia is far more pernicious, far more evil than the two. So between the two of them, J.K. Williams says passive euthanasia, the one that would more likely be the case, because if it is a climate where doctors are allowed to make those decisions on behalf of patients, it's more likely to happen. So euthanasia contains within the possibility that we will work against our own interests, right? That human nature, that drive to survive. 2, there's always a possibility that an experimental procedure or some untried technique might just happen around the corner and might pull us through. And we should keep that option open, because if we don't and we decide to act on our instincts and we wish to go follow through with euthanasia, we're gone. We're dead. We're no longer available for this new treatment. And finally, knowing that we can take a life at any time might incline doctors and us to give up too early. If we know that we can engage in doctor-assisted suicide, we're less likely to hold on, right? Suffer a little bit longer in the hopes that a cure will be found. So because we have that system in place, J.K. Williams believes that there will be a likelihood for us to give up too early, give up the fight too early, that will to survive will be extinguished sooner, or worse, using passive euthanasia, that decision will be made on our behalf, which is even worse. So in a climate of passive euthanasia and euthanasia in general, doctors and nurses typically were fighting to save lives. But now euthanasia will have this kind of corrupting influence on them. Now, this is what Williams is talking about. They may not try hard enough to save patients. They'll decide that maybe they're just better off dead. And that's kind of dangerous. So euthanasia as a policy has that potential slippery slope, something, again, that I'm not saying is a good way to argue, but there is the possibility that the way that Williams has structured it, that if euthanasia becomes very common, there will be a tendency, not a fact, but there is a tendency that doctors and patients, or doctors and nurses, may not try as hard or give up too early. And so if that's the case, that decision is now out of your hands. And euthanasia is no longer a personal and voluntary action, but something made on behalf of you by someone else. And that's kind of dangerous. Okay, so I'm not sure how long this has been going. I've been trying to stay as brief as I can. What I will say, though, very briefly, is the structure of the test. It's in 4 parts. First part is true and false questions. There'll be 10 of them, worth 10 marks. Second part, identify and explain. And I want you to identify and explain in a couple of sentences 5 terms. I think there's a total of maybe 12. So identify and explain only 5 of those terms. That's worth 10 marks. The third part is short answer questions. There are 5 of them there, each worth 3 marks, total 15. And those can be answered in 3 or 4 sentences. So they are literally short answer questions. The last part is a longer answer question worth 15 marks. And there you have a choice. I think there's a choice of either 2 or 3 different questions. Answer only one. Now, it says it right on the test, so if you forget which part, there's some options. There are some options which not. Don't worry. I've written it down. I'm also going to write it on the announcement so you can see it. But the test is in those 4 parts. It's worth a total of 50 points or 50 marks. It will take 2 hours to write, and it will be open until Sunday, February the 19th. So I'm going to write all that information down, but I wanted to just let you know the video as well. If that's the case, if you have any questions before you start, please let me know. If you have any issues after as well. But the test is now open, and you have until the 19th. So it's a week. You've got a week. So in fact, anytime this coming week, I'd like to have everyone finished by the 19th, because then you will have an actual break during the reading week. So finish going through the slides one last time if you like. Look at all the key points that I have at the end of the modules, because that's essentially what I was talking about, and you should do fine. So have a good week or a good weekend, because it's just starting on it's Friday evening, and we'll talk to each other in a couple of weeks. Take care then. Bye-bye.